He used to whisper my name like a promise. Now even his silence feels expensive. The house echoes with a voice that isn't mine anymore. Winter had arrived quietly that year. No storms, no thunder. Just a gray hush that settled over the mansion like a heavy sigh. Snow drifted against the glass walls, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and old perfume. I remember thinking how the firelight seemed smaller now, like even the flames were tired of pretending warmth. Our house was beautiful. Too beautiful, maybe. The kind of beauty that hides coldness behind marble and chandeliers. My reflection followed me as I moved through the rooms, polished floors turning every step into a whisper I didn't want to hear. That evening, I set the table for 3, out of habit, not hope. Silver cutlery gleamed, glasses waited, and the scent of rosemary and roast chicken filled the space. It should have felt comforting. It didn't. He texted earlier, working late. Don't wait up. I stared at those words until the light from my phone dimmed. Working late had become his favorite alibi. I didn't need to ask with whom. The way he looked past me lately was answer enough. There was a time he used to come home hungry. For food, for me, for the life we built together. He'd drop his coat, kiss the back of my neck, and whisper, "Don't change a thing." I used to think that meant he loved the way I was. Later I realized it meant he loved that I never questioned him. Tonight, the grandfather clock struck 9. The roast cooled. The candles burned low. I sat at the head of the table and listened to the slow tick of time unraveling. When I finally rose to clear the table, his napkin was still folded neatly on the plate. It looked untouched, like the seat beside it. Something inside me, something small and quiet, broke in a way that couldn't be heard. Upstairs, the bedroom felt colder. The sheets were crisp, untouched since morning. His scent lingered faintly, a mix of smoke and the cologne I'd bought him last anniversary. That bottle had once meant something. Now it made my stomach turn. When I reached for his laundry basket, I noticed a shirt draped across the side. Pale blue cotton, his favorite. I picked it up gently, meaning to fold it. That's when I saw it. The faint curve of lipstick on the collar. A color too deep, too red to be mine. For a moment, I just stood there staring. My body didn't move, didn't flinch. It was as if my mind had known long before my hands did. The silence of the room pressed around me, heavy as grief. I didn't cry. Instead, I placed the shirt back exactly as I'd found it, folded my hands in my lap, and sat by the window. Outside, snow began to fall harder, thick flakes swirling like lost letters. I watched until the glass fogged with my breath. He was out there somewhere, laughing softly, maybe feeding her from his plate the way he once did me. I imagined her, a woman younger, softer, with the kind of charm that still believes in promises. Maybe she thought she'd won something. Maybe she didn't know I existed. Or maybe she did, and loved the victory more. Either way, I pitied her. Because she was falling for a man who couldn't tell the truth even to himself. When the clock struck 10, I went to my vanity. There, among the perfume bottles and fading photographs, was a small wooden box, carved by my father when I was 19. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all written by me, none ever sent. They were pieces of the woman I used to be, hopeful, naive, proud of how deeply she could love. I opened one, dated 6 years ago. My love, if the world ever turns quiet between us, I hope we still find each other in the silence. I smiled, a sad, crooked thing. The world had turned quiet indeed, but I was the only one still listening. I folded the letter back carefully, tied the ribbon again, and closed the lid. My reflection in the vanity mirror looked unfamiliar. Older, yes, but also steadier. There was a calm in my face I hadn't noticed before. Maybe that's what happens when pain finally stops burning and begins to settle into understanding. Later, I walked through the mansion's hallways, barefoot on marble. My footsteps sounded softer than they should. Every painting, every piece of furniture had a memory attached. A birthday dinner, a laughter-filled night, a kiss at the bottom of the staircase. The air felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by versions of us that no longer existed. I I paused at the grand piano in the corner of the living room. Dust had gathered on the keys. He used to play for me when the world still felt tender. I brushed my fingers across the ivory, pressing one note. It echoed through the emptiness, pure and lonely. Outside, the garden lights glowed faintly beneath the snow. I opened the balcony doors and stepped out, letting the cold sting my skin. The trees were bare, their branches trembling in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint hum of a car engine passing the main gate. I wondered if it was him. Then I realized I didn't care. The truth had already settled quietly in me like the snow on the railing. Inevitable, soundless, irreversible. I whispered into the wind. He thinks this house is his kingdom. He doesn't know it was built on my quiet hands. When I married him, I thought love meant giving everything. My time, my voice, my dreams. He was charming, confident, the kind of man who filled every room like a spotlight. And I was content to be the quiet strength behind him. The company that bore his name was once my father's. When he passed, I let my husband run it. He said I shouldn't bother myself with numbers and meetings. He said I belonged somewhere softer. And for years I believed him, but that night, sitting in the quiet glow of the fire, I remembered my father's voice. The way he used to look at me across his study table and say, "You have your mother's calm, but my mind. Don't let anyone convince you that calm means weak." I poured myself a glass of wine and stood before the large mirror by the fireplace. The woman staring back was elegant but distant, her silk dress catching the light, her bare shoulders kissed by shadows. She looked like she belonged there, yet not at all. Maybe that was my curse. I had built this life with care, but in doing so, I had erased myself from it. The sound of the front door opening broke the silence. Footsteps. Slow, steady. Then his voice, low, measured, slightly slurred, still awake. I didn't turn. "You said you'd be late." He hesitated. Meeting ran over. I could smell the perfume on his coat before I saw him. Sweet, expensive, unfamiliar. He walked closer, set his briefcase down, and kissed the side of my head. His lips were cold. "You didn't have to wait up," he murmured. "I didn't," I said softly. "I was just thinking." "About what?" "The house," I lied. "It feels quieter lately." He chuckled, that practiced laugh that used to charm investors and crush arguments. "It's winter. Everything's quieter." He poured himself a drink, oblivious to how carefully I was memorizing every detail. The loosened tie, the faint lipstick mark on his wrist, the flicker in his eyes when he looked at the fire instead of me. I wanted to ask him when he stopped loving me. But I knew he'd only say he hadn't. He went upstairs after finishing his drink. I stayed by the fire until the wood turned to ash. When I finally made my way to bed, he was already asleep, back turned, breathing heavy. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of a man who no longer belonged to me. At some point in the night, I slipped out of bed and stood by the window. The moonlight washed over everything in silver, cold, soft, distant. I pressed my palm against the glass, and for a brief moment, I saw the reflection of a woman I used to know. Warm, patient. Certain that love could fix anything, I whispered to her, "You did your best." Then I turned away. Morning came pale and slow. He was gone by sunrise, leaving only the faint scent of cologne and a note on the counter. Lunch meeting. Don't wait for dinner. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen island, the steam curling upward like something alive. The snow outside glittered in the light. It was beautiful but lonely. Everything was beautiful, but lonely. I thought of the girl I once was, the one who believed that giving someone everything would make them stay. I wondered what she'd think if she knew that someday she'd live in a mansion full of everything she'd ever wanted, and still feel like a stranger inside her own home. That evening, I found myself back by the window as twilight bled into blue. The city lights in the distance flickered like scattered stars. My reflection merged with the world outside, a woman framed by glass, quiet, unbroken. For the first time in months, I felt something close to strength. Not the loud kind that demands to be seen, but the quiet kind that survives. I ran my fingers along the window's cold edge and whispered, "He doesn't know it yet. But this house, this company, this empire, it was never his to take." And then I smiled, softly, almost to myself. Because deep down, I already knew. The storm hadn't destroyed me. It had only cleared the path for who I was always meant to become. Her perfume arrived before she did, sweet, expensive, artificial. The kind that lingered in rooms long after truth had left. I smelled it first on his coat, then on the pillow beside his, and finally, one morning, in the hallway of my own home. That's when I knew. She wasn't just a shadow anymore. She was crossing the threshold. He didn't call it moving in. He called it space. Said we both needed it. Said life had gotten complicated. He sat across from me in the living room. Sunlight on his wedding ring, coffee untouched. He couldn't meet my eyes for long. I didn't press him. I'd already learned that asking a man to be honest when he's built on lies is like asking the ocean to stay still. "I'll be staying at the guest house for a while," he said, pretending it was temporary. I only nodded, stirring my tea, letting the spoon clink gently against the cup. That sound, small and rhythmic, kept me from shaking. I could have asked who she was. But names don't matter when the betrayal has already carved its place inside you. A week passed. Then one evening, the gates opened for a sleek black car. I watched from the upstairs window as she stepped out. Long hair, red nails, careful smile. Her heels clicked against the stone driveway like punctuation marks in a sentence I never wrote. He greeted her with a hand on her back, a gesture that used to be mine. She hesitated before walking up the steps, glancing toward the windows. For a moment, our eyes met. Or maybe she only felt it. That unseen awareness women have when they sense another woman's ghost nearby. That night, laughter echoed from the dining hall. The same room where I once poured him wine and whispered dreams. Now her voice, lighter, untested, filled the space. I didn't go downstairs. Instead, I walked the long corridor toward my father's study. The air there still smelled faintly of tobacco and oak, as if he might walk in at any moment, humming softly, reminding me to trust what I already know. His old desk sat by the window, covered in dust but untouched. Inside the drawer, I found what I hadn't thought about in years, the company ledger, the founding papers of Windsor & Co., and at the bottom, the signature that mattered most, my father's, beside mine. My name, not my husband's, beside every legal right to the empire he believed he controlled. I ran my fingers over the ink, feeling its permanence. That single detail, quiet, simple, powerful, was the difference between illusion and truth. He'd never asked. He'd only assumed. That was his greatest mistake. The next morning I heard them in the garden. Her laughter, his low murmur. He was showing her the fountain, the one my father imported from Florence. I could hear pride in his voice. He loved playing king. From the balcony above, I watched silently. They looked like a perfect picture. The man who thinks he's won, and the woman who believes she's chosen. I almost felt sorry for both of them. By noon, I'd gathered myself into grace. That's what heartbreak taught me, the art of stillness. I prepared tea and asked the maid to serve it to the guests. When I entered the dining room, her eyes widened slightly. She must have thought I'd gone. He smiled, strained, pretending everything was ordinary. "Ah," he said. "This is..." But she interrupted softly. "Oh, are you the house manager?" For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Her words hung in the air. Light, careless, but cutting deeper than she could ever know. He froze, didn't correct her. Didn't say a word. I smiled. "Something like that," I said gently. Then I poured her tea. Perfectly steady hands. If humiliation had a sound, it would be silence thick enough to hear your own heartbeat. That night, I stood before the mirror in the guest bathroom. A smaller, simpler mirror than the one in our bedroom. It reflected a woman who was both invisible and invincible. It struck me then. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner of the room, watching everything, saying nothing, and I had all the power. He just hadn't realized it yet. The days blurred together like water over glass. Their voices moved through the mansion. Her laughter, his charm, their illusion. I existed in the background, a quiet observer of their little kingdom. Sometimes she'd leave a scarf draped over a chair. Sometimes he'd forget to hide her perfume. Sometimes I'd find them in the garden, and he'd look at me the way a man looks at his own conscience. Startled, guilty, then dismissive. I let him. Let them both, because silence isn't surrender, it's preparation. One evening, after they'd gone out, I returned to the study again. The ledger sat open on the desk. Beside it, a photo of my father and me on the day he signed the will. I could still hear his voice. If a man ever forgets your worth, don't remind him. Just remember it yourself. I traced the edge of that photograph until the room felt warmer. Then I made a call. To the family lawyer, Mr. Alden. Is everything still in place? I asked. His voice softened. Yes, ma'am. Every property, every account, every share, all under your name. As your father intended. Good, I whispered. Then nothing needs changing. I hung up and looked around the study, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and quiet pride. He thought he was replacing me, but he was merely decorating the cage I had already unlocked. The next week, they hosted a small dinner. Investors, friends, the kind of people who smile with their teeth. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. From the upper balcony, I watched through the crystal railing. The chandelier glowed gold, and beneath it, my husband stood with his arm around her waist, toasting to new beginnings. Her laughter tinkled like glass, and I wondered if she knew that everything in that room, the wine, the chandelier, the floor beneath their feet, belonged to the woman standing silently above them. They called it victory. I called it theater. Later that night, after the guests had gone, I walked downstairs. The dining room was still warm, smelling of wine and perfume. Half-empty glasses, lipstick stains, laughter fading into memory. I gathered the plates myself. The maid offered to help, but I shook my head. Some rituals are sacred. As I cleared the table, I noticed her scarf again, left carelessly on the back of a chair. Silk, pale pink, soft between my fingers. I folded it neatly and placed it beside the vase of white lilies. Not out of kindness. Out of control, because even in her presence, this was still my house. That night, I couldn't sleep. The moonlight spilled through the window, silvering everything it touched. I sat at the edge of the bed, the quiet pressing down like snow. I thought about the girl I used to be, how she'd built her marriage on trust and devotion, and how she mistook silence for peace. But peace, I realized, isn't the absence of conflict. It's the decision to stop participating in what hurts you. In the morning, I found them at breakfast. She sat in my chair, his hand resting lazily on hers. They both looked up, startled when I entered. "Good morning," I said softly. My tone made them uneasy, not because it was sharp, but because it wasn't. He muttered something about a meeting. She avoided my gaze. I poured myself coffee and stood by the window, watching the snow melt into dew. Then I said quietly, without turning around, "Take care of the house. It tends to bite those who don't respect it." Neither of them replied. They didn't understand what I meant, not yet. But they would. By noon I was gone. I packed only what I needed. My father's journal, the letters I'd written, the key to my new place. As I closed the front door behind me, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt earned. The driver loaded my last suitcase into the car. From the rear window, I saw him standing in the doorway, her silhouette beside his. Two figures framed by arrogance and illusion. He thought I was leaving in defeat. He didn't realize I was leaving with everything. The land, the mansion, the empire. All under my name, all bought by my family's legacy, not his. He'd only been living in my story, and tonight, I was writing the ending myself. As the car drove down the long avenue of winter trees, I looked back one last time. Snow fell softly on the mansion's roof, and I realized something simple and beautiful. He could fill the house with anyone he wanted, but he'd never feel at home again. Because home isn't built from walls, it's built from honesty. And he'd burned that long ago. The sky began to clear. Somewhere behind the clouds, the sun waited. The kind of light that doesn't ask for permission to shine. I rested my head against the window and whispered to myself, "Let them have their illusion." I own the ground beneath it. The house was quieter now. Not empty, not hollow, just still. Sometimes, when the sun fell over the marble floors in the late afternoon, I'd see my reflection moving through the hallways like a ghost. My hair a little longer, my steps slower. But I was here, breathing in the silence I once feared. The staff still worked as before, though the air had changed. No more frantic whispers, no more perfume trails that weren't mine. I had turned the mansion into something gentler, the scent of cinnamon bread instead of roses, laughter echoing faintly from the kitchen, soft jazz replacing the brittle clinking of glasses. And yet, on certain evenings, I'd stand by the window of my old bedroom and wonder, did he ever feel it? The weight of what he traded away for something that glittered only under shallow light. That question used to ache. Now it only hummed quietly, like a tune you've long forgotten but can still hum by instinct. The letter came on a Thursday. A thin white envelope with his handwriting, still neat, still measured. Inside only a few lines. "The company is gone. She left. I'm sorry, no signature, no plea. Just that, I read it once. Then again. Then placed it inside a drawer beside my late mother's brooch, the same one I had worn on our wedding day. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. Because grief, when stretched over time, stops having sharp edges. It turns into something else, a quiet acceptance, a soft nod to what was and will never be again. He showed up 2 weeks later. At the gates, I almost didn't recognize him. The sharpness was gone. The arrogance replaced by something weathered, like a man who had walked through too many storms with no compass left. His shoulders hunched slightly, his suit no longer fitted, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Amara," he said when the guard let him in. "Just my name." I stood on the steps of the mansion, my mansion, wearing a pale sweater and holding a cup of tea, steam rising into the crisp morning air. He looked at me like a man approaching a ghost. He wasn't sure was real. "I shouldn't have come," he muttered, his voice breaking somewhere between guilt and pride. "Then why did you?" I asked softly. He swallowed. "Because I didn't know where else to go." The silence that followed wasn't cruel. It was long, heavy, full of unsaid things that had once mattered. I motioned him inside. The house greeted him like it remembered everything. Every echo of his footsteps, every shadow of our laughter, every word that had ever turned sharp before softening into regret. He glanced around. The flowers were different, the portraits changed, but the bones of the house were the same. The warmth he once ignored now touched everything. "You changed it," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "It needed to breathe again." He nodded, his hand brushing over the banister he once gripped in anger. "I ruined everything," he whispered. I didn't correct him. Instead, I set the tea between us and said, "Sometimes, things fall apart so we can see what was never truly whole." He looked up then, really looked, and I saw the man I had once loved buried beneath layers of ambition and pride. His eyes wet, voice low. "I lost it all, Amara. The company, the cars, her. She drained me dry and I kept thinking you'd come back." I breathed in slowly, watching the light shift across his face. "You replaced me before I could even leave." He closed his eyes. I thought I was chasing happiness. Turns out I was just running from peace. I smiled faintly. Peace is harder to live with than pleasure. You have to face yourself in it. For a moment, the air softened. We sat there, two people who had once promised forever and failed beautifully at it. He broke the silence again. "Do you ever miss me?" The question lingered like fog. I thought of the nights I'd spent tracing old photographs with my fingertips. The laughter we had before the storm, the way his hand once found mine in the dark without asking. I miss who we were before we forgot how to be kind, I said, but not who we became. He nodded slowly, a tear catching the light. You deserved better. I became better, I replied gently. After he left, I walked through the halls again, each step lighter. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt lived in. In the drawing room, I unfolded an old letter I had written but never sent. It was to myself. You will rebuild quietly. You will love again, not because you need to, but because you've learned that love isn't owed, it's offered. And when the world tries to tell you you were weak for forgiving, remember, forgiveness was how you freed yourself. I smiled, folded it back, and placed it beside the brooch. Some stories don't need revenge. Some just need closure. Weeks passed. The garden began to bloom again, wild, untrimmed, free. Children from the nearby orphanage I supported now came on weekends. They ran across the lawn with laughter loud enough to fill every room that once knew arguments. I would sit on the porch with a book, watching them, tea in hand. One little girl, Lila, always brought me flowers, half wilted but full of heart. Miss Amara, she said one day, holding a crumpled daisy, is this your house? I smiled. Yes, it is, she beamed. It's the prettiest house I've ever seen. Do you know why? I asked. She shook her head. Because it's full of second chances. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I lit the fireplace again. The same one where we once planned a future that never came to be. But this time, I wasn't waiting for footsteps or apologies. I was home, truly home. Outside, rain began to fall softly, tapping against the windows. The smell of earth filled the air, clean and new. I opened the window just enough to feel a few drops touch my skin. And in that quiet, between the crackle of fire and the rhythm of rain, I whispered to no one in particular. I'm finally free. In the following months, the world shifted gently. I sold part of the company I had secretly owned, turned it into a foundation for women rebuilding after betrayal, loss, and loneliness. We called it the House of Second Chances. Each letter of gratitude I received reminded me that healing wasn't selfish. It was shared. Each story I read echoed mine in some small, tender way. And in the corner of my office sat a framed quote that I had written the day he left. Strength isn't in never breaking. It's in rebuilding softer. One night, just as the sky turned violet, I received a call. It was him. He was leaving the city, moving somewhere quieter. He said he'd found peace too, in small ways, helping others, reading again, learning how to be alone without being lonely. There was no bitterness between us anymore. Only gratitude that our story, painful as it was, had led us both to something gentler. Before hanging up, he said, "Thank you for forgiving me, even when I didn't deserve it." And I answered softly, "Thank you for teaching me who I could become without you." The line went quiet, and I knew that was the end of our chapter. Sometimes I still walk through the mansion at night, barefoot, tracing the cool marble beneath my feet. I pause by the grand window that overlooks the garden, now full of life. The moonlight spills in, painting silver across the walls. I think about how far I've come. From the woman replaced to the woman reborn, from the silence of heartbreak to the music of peace. Then, in that silver light, I whisper the story not as a wound, but as a memory. He replaced me with his mistress. But I secretly owned the mansion, and in the end, I owned my freedom too. There's a moment, just before dawn, when the world feels suspended. Not asleep, not awake, just caught in a hush between breaths. That's when I love the house most. The walls seem to listen. The chandeliers rest like frozen tears, and the soft hum of the heater in the far corridor feels like a lullaby for ghosts that no longer linger. I walk barefoot through the hallway, my fingertips grazing the polished wood, the scent of rain still clinging to the curtains. The air feels clean, washed of memory, but rich with peace. The empire that once chained me had become my quiet inheritance. And for the first time, I wasn't guarding it. I was living in it. That morning, I brewed coffee the way my mother used to. Strong, a hint of cinnamon, always poured into chipped porcelain cups that made everything taste like nostalgia. As the kettle hissed, I noticed the sunlight touching the piano in the corner of the drawing room. Dust motes danced like fragments of forgotten laughter. I hadn't played in years. The last time I did, he was standing behind me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, his reflection caught in the glass frame of the wedding photo above. Now that photo was gone. In its place hung a landscape, a vast field under gray skies, painted by a local artist I'd supported through my foundation. I sat at the piano, pressed one key, then another. The sound filled the air, imperfect, trembling, but honest. It reminded me of myself. Later that week, I visited the small community center that our foundation had rebuilt. It wasn't grand. White walls, a garden blooming out front, laughter echoing from a group of women learning basic accounting inside. I watched them through the glass. Women of all ages, faces marked by loss and survival, eyes carrying the same fire I once thought I'd lost forever. When they saw me, they smiled. Some stood. One of them, a young mother with ink-stained fingers, walked over and said, "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you. You gave us back our dignity." Her words caught in my throat like prayer. I reached for her hand and whispered, "No, my dear, you gave yourselves back your future. I just built the door." That night I came home to find an envelope slipped under my door. No address, no name, just a faint scent of cedar and something familiar. Inside, a short note. "I've started over. In a small coastal town. I build furniture now. It's simple, but it's mine. Thank you for everything, even the silence. Elias." For a moment, I stared at the handwriting, tracing the grooves of the pen against the paper. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness this time. It was closure, quiet, final, and kind. I placed it beside the others. The letter he'd once written in despair, the one I wrote to myself, and the deed papers to the house. All the remnants of a life that had been both ruin and rebirth. And then I locked the drawer, not out of bitterness, but completion. The following weekend, the mansion was full again, not of guests in gowns or glasses clinking in hollow celebration, but of laughter, song, and the scent of baked bread. The foundation's board had gathered, women who had turned pain into purpose, who'd built shops, shelters, and classrooms with the funds we raised. We called it the Harvest Gathering, our yearly tradition to celebrate growth, not in wealth, but in healing. As the sun melted behind the trees, I looked around, faces glowing in candlelight, hands clasped, stories shared. It wasn't the empire I once imagined. It was far richer. In the corner of the garden stood a small stone plaque. I'd had it made weeks ago, engraved with a line that had followed me through every storm. Not everything you lose is meant to be found again. Every time I read it, I felt a strange peace. Because I had finally learned that love doesn't end with absence. It changes form, becomes memory, then wisdom, then grace. As autumn folded into winter, I decided to open one more chapter, not in business, but in life I adopted. Her name was Isla, 4 years old, with dark curls and the most serious eyes I'd ever seen. She rarely spoke at first, but when she did, her voice was soft, certain, like she'd been watching the world long enough to understand it. The first night she stayed in the mansion, she wouldn't sleep alone. So I held her until dawn, humming the same melody my mother once sang to me. When she finally drifted off, I realized the house no longer echoed. It had a heartbeat again. Days became gentler. We built rituals, baking cookies every Sunday, dancing to old records on rainy afternoons, reading stories by the firelight. She started calling me Mama one morning, her voice barely above a whisper. And in that small sound, every broken part of me healed just a little more. The mansion, once a symbol of betrayal and power, now smelled of crayons and laughter. The walls had stopped remembering pain. They had learned joy. One evening, I found Isla sitting at the piano. Her fingers were pressing random keys, creating tiny, chaotic bursts of sound. I sat beside her, guiding her hand softly. "That note," I said, pointing to C. "That's the beginning of everything." She looked up at me, eyes wide. "Like us?" I smiled. "Exactly like us," she nodded thoughtfully, then leaned her head on my shoulder. Outside, snow had begun to fall, slow, deliberate flakes that clung to the windows like tiny blessings. That night, after tucking Isla in, I went to the porch with a blanket and a cup of cocoa. The garden shimmered under the moonlight, white, endless, forgiving. I thought of Elias again, somewhere by the coast, probably carving wood with hands that once held ambition like a weapon. I hoped he'd found what I had, peace without noise. The wind carried the faint chime of the garden bells I'd hung months ago. Each note reminded me of something I used to fear, and how it no longer held power. I whispered to the night, "Thank you," for the ending that became a beginning. Years passed. The mansion aged gracefully, as did I. Isla grew, taller, surer, laughter brighter than any chandelier I ever owned. On her 16th birthday, she found the drawer. The letters. She read them quietly, sitting by the same fire where I once rebuilt myself. When she looked up, her eyes glistened. "Why didn't you hate him, Mama?" I smiled gently. "Because hate keeps you tied to what hurt you. Forgiveness sets you free." She thought for a long moment, then whispered, "Then you must be the freest person I know." I reached for her hand. I wasn't always, but I learned. On the last page of my life, or perhaps just the next chapter, I write these words by the window, the same window that once reflected my tears, now framed by the laughter of a life reborn. He replaced me with his mistress, but I secretly owned the mansion, the empire, and the silence that followed. What I didn't know was, the greatest thing I'd ever own would be my peace. I look out at the horizon, where dawn is breaking once again, soft gold spilling over the snow, melting the edges of yesterday. The house, the land, the empire, they're hers now. Isla's. But more than that, she inherits the quiet courage it took to start again. And as the fire crackles beside me, I smile. Because every story of loss, when told with an open heart, becomes a map, not back to what was, but toward what waits. If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories matter.